So right now we're having this users table, but imagine we want to do alter this table. So changing something about the table is really easy by using alter table, the name of the table, in our case users. And now we can, for example, say, what do we want to do? So in our case, we want to, for example, add a column. So we're going to say add column. And now we can specify the column name that we want to add. So in our case, this might be age, for example. Now we can also define certain things like the data type right here. So we can say, okay, we want to use an int, for example. We also want to say that this here is unsigned. And we want to check whether our age, for example, has an age of maybe greater or equal to 0 and less or equal to, let's say, 130. Oops, and this is my bad. Obviously, we need age here once again. And now this should work. So now we can execute this code and say we're going to run this. And right here we have an error code because we did not select the database. So in order to select the database, again, we need to use users underline db because this is the name of our database. And inside of this database, we want to alter table. So let's run the code. And now this worked. So we affected 5 rows. And if we are going to reload, you can now see that we have an age row. But now let's say, okay, we're not really happy with using an integer because an integer might be too much for just storing an age and a tiny int might be enough. So in order to do so, we can say, again, we are going to use alter table users, modify. In our case, we want to modify a column and we want to modify the column age, for example. And we want to say that our age now has the data type of tiny int, for example. So let's again execute the code. We're going to run this. And as you can see, now that we're reloading it, we get age tiny int. But as you see, we lost pretty much everything except our tiny int. So if you wanted to keep all of those values, you would need to go ahead and type all of them in here again. And then you could, for example, execute the code. And right now, when reloading this and selecting age, you see that now we have a tiny int and unsigned, for example. But we lost our check condition since we didn't redefine that one again. So that actually happens when using modify column. You can also rename the age. So you could, for example, say rename column age to what do we want to rename this to? Maybe user underline age. So now we're going to save this. We're going to run the code. We're going to reload the database. And now, or actually we're getting an error. So let's just rename, for example, also username to just username, for example. And we're going to run this code. And now we get a success message. We're going to refresh the table. And now we can see we have username right here. But obviously I don't want to have username. So I'm going to reverse this by saying username to username, for example. Maybe we wanted to drop our age column right now because we don't really need that. So we're going to say drop column age, for example. And now we run this code and we dropped our age column. We're going to reload. And as you can see, age is essentially gone. So to sum up, you can add a column, you can modify a column, you can rename a column, and you can drop a column.